Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy, the expert's ghostwriter, and I help trailblazers and leaders write books that make money and an impact. I'm an author, creator of the Crank Out Your Book in 8 Weeks signature program in which I teach you how to be a ghostwriter, and I offer signature bespoke ghostwriting and book editing services. And I welcome all of you to the Dr. Cindy Show, where I do interviews with industry experts and give my very best tips and tricks on writing a book, publishing, editing, author platforms, and all the good things. And this summer, 2021, I am cranking out my own book in 8 weeks. And you are watching the week 2 episode when I'm going to walk you through what I do in the second week of Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks and how that correlates to working with my ghostwriting clients. And that's what we are really talking about a lot today, because in week 2, I teach you how to be your own ghostwriter. So what's that about, really? Well, as a ghostwriter, what I do is the same things we do in week 1 of Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks to get clear on who the target reader is, their goals for the book, where the book's going to be positioned in the marketplace, agreeing on the table of contents. And the next thing we do is we start doing author interviews. I don't just immediately start writing a first draft. How on earth could I if that's all I know? So what happens is I write interview questions, and for my VIP option, in which we do the entire ghostwriting interview in a long weekend of 8-hour days, it is grueling, I assure you, but it's also amazing in such a short amount of time to have all the interviews completed, so I can more quickly get to the fun stuff of editing it and fleshing it out and starting to turn it into your book. And so what we do in Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks, once we have the detailed table of contents from week 1, then here I instruct everyone to write their own interview questions as if they are their own ghostwriter. And the reason that I do that is when I'm interviewing someone, they're the expert. They have experienced everything that's going to be in the book. And I can just ask them to tell me about it, and they can very easily speak to it. And so the theory holds that the same thing will happen when you're writing. If you're just answering questions and you're not being called upon to think, because you've already done this work, what's the reader going to want to know? What's going to be relevant to them? You've done that work already. Then it just comes time to answer the questions the reader will have, so you fill it in your draft. So with all that said, I'm about to share my screen and show you how it went for me. But I'm also going to tell you something that my Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks students have experienced, and it also turned out to be the case for me when I did the week 2 exercise. So in the course, a fair amount of the students, nearly all of them, do not complete all the self-questions in week 2. And I always say, it's okay, do as much as you can, at least get 3 or 4 chapters fleshed out with the questions, because what we have to start doing in week 3 is we start drafting so that we can follow the process, which I'll be sharing more about in the week 3 video. So for week 2, we're doing the open-ended questions that you will then answer. So we're not interviewing ourselves in week 2 and answering the questions as we write them, but we're just asking ourselves those questions that we're going to answer. And I help my students a lot. It is amazing how much I help them. I have templates with a lot of kind of stock questions that you can choose from, and I give them lots of ways to customize that for their own book. And when you're in my VIP program, you show me what you have, and I adapt your questions and even create some for you to better show you how you can use this exercise for your particular book. So even with all that help, though, not many people get it all done. And so guess what? The same thing happened to me in week 2. I wrote my self-interview questions for chapter 1 on the first day of week 2, it was exactly like I would expect it to be. It usually takes me about 20 to 30 minutes to do a chapter's worth of interview questions. And I hit that on the mark, and I was like, okay, but that was just one in that day. So I realized really to get all 11 of my chapters fleshed out with the questions, it would be helpful for me to do like maybe 2 a day. So then on the second day of week 2, I did chapter 2 and also chapter 3. So like, let me just tell you, then I pretty much felt like a rock star. Well, then came the next day, and I opened a file for chapter 4 where I'm going to write those interview questions. And I just started hitting a blank. And what I do for myself, when I hit a blank when I'm working on a client project, is I just pull up something else in their project that I know how to do right then, and then I will come back to what I had trouble with later when I may have some more clarity because of something else I've done. And in fact, I give that advice to my students as well, to, if you are, whether it's your self-interview questions or when you're in the drafting phase, something, if you open it and you're drawing a blank, we'll just go somewhere else, because it can also be true. And this happens sometimes even with my ghostwriting clients. There's something that slipped through the table of contents that doesn't really belong in the book. And sometimes we have to get to the interview phase before that becomes clear. But something different was happening here for me with chapter 4. And I'm going to go ahead and share this the week 2 folder here with you now for Be Your Own Ghostwriter. And so it's kind of funny. I only got to chapter 4, and this is embarrassing, by the way. It's hilarious. The camera is not on me at this moment because of the share screen, because it is embarrassing to admit this. So what's going on in the week 2 folder? So I've got the table of contents here for reference. I copied it from the week 1 folder and put it here. And then I'm putting, as I complete a set of self-questions, I'm putting it in blue highlights so I know that that is done. And then here I've got some notes for myself. Another thing that I suggest to my Crank Out Your Book in 8 Weeks students is, when you come to a problem, or when you're not sure what to do with something, or if it might take too long to change it right then, but you have the idea, the best thing to do is to just put a note for yourself so that you have it later when you can come back to it. And you'll see, even now, I've just finished chapter 5, and we don't have chapter 6 and beyond. And I'm currently in week 5 of Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks. So this week 2 exercise stumped me as well. But here is what I found when I went to, so just to show you for reference. So here's what chapter 3 is. So boom, I take from the table of contents what I wanted to talk about when I was 21 and adopted my first indoor cat, Quilla. And then I have a very healthy list of questions about that. And then the next, adopting my next kitten, Puck, and then a good amount of questions about that. So here, for the different stories that I wanted to cover in this chapter, I've got a good amount of questions for all of them. And then I came over to chapter 4, and I looked at this list of questions, and every time I opened this file, which was several times during the second week, and I kept thinking, I've got some time tomorrow, I'll be able to knock it out, and I would just open it and be confused. And I'm going to be telling you in week 4 or week 5 maybe, what I did to become unconfused. But here at this point, I just had to be honest with myself, because I was at the end of the second week, and this was, I'm going to say again, this was embarrassing, because I'm writing my book in public and sharing the Google Drive folder with my entire email newsletter list. And so everybody knew that I had not done all the self-questions in week 2. And there are a few thoughts that I have about that. So number 1, I will come back later when I tell you about when I started trying to draft chapter 4, and then I had to revisit what was bugging me about being able to answer those self questions. And somehow I was always so anxious and I had other things on my mind. I didn't remember my own advice to maybe try chapter 5 and keep moving on that way. So I kind of needed to hire myself to like coach me, as well as just doing the work and knowing how to do it. And the other thing is, I thought about this too later. So what I've described in Crank Out Your Book in 8 weeks and doing all the self questions in week 2 is what I do in those VIP, author interview weekends. But the other way that I work with ghostwriting clients is we might, over a 2 or 3 month period, have a 2-hour interview once or sometimes twice a week over that period of 2 or 3 months. And when I do that, well, for the first interview, I probably would have the first 2 or 3 chapters with the questions done, and then I would need to see in the interview, usually chapter 1, sometimes that takes a whole interview because the client is, they're figuring out how to answer the questions to give me what I'm looking for. I may be adjusting the questions. If I don't hear what I was looking for with one question, I have to find another way to ask it. We're kind of finding our footing together. And, at that first interview, I wouldn't have planned what I would be asking them in what's expected to be the last interview, maybe 16 weeks into the future. So I would do that as I go. And the other thing I'll say that I tell my students that don't finish all their self questions in week 2 is, as you get to week 3 and you start drafting and answering the questions for the chapters that you have filled them out, you start writing smarter questions. You start realizing it doesn't take as many questions as I was asking myself, because there are some things I'm going to naturally easily put down and not forget. And then there's going to be other things that I need those questions for, or else I will leave it out for whatever reason. Those are vary from author to author. So, at the end of week 2, I just had to forgive myself, give myself permission to be where I clearly was. And then starting week 3 was just to take those week 1 questions the chapter 1 questions and start answering them and just work on my word count. So this is everything that I had to share for my own process of following my week 2 exercise to be my own ghostwriter. And in the next video, I'll be sharing what happened when I got to week 3 to warp speed my writing and actually start drafting the book. So stay tuned.